self-government won't be just good for Indigenous peoples, but it'll be good for non-Indigenous peoples, for Canadians, for Canada. And it'll help us get to our high ideals as a country.
Hi, I'm Tamara, and this is TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Self-government is about more than politics. It's about language, culture, and the right to decide your own future. Author Bob Joseph explains how Indigenous nations are transitioning to self-governance, restoring culture and language, and building thriving nations on their own terms. We discuss why self-government matters to every Canadian and how it can create a more prosperous country for all of us. I hope you enjoy the conversation. This podcast is brought to you by TELUS Smart Home Security. Secure, simplify, and easily monitor your home from anywhere using the Smart Home Security app. Visit TELUS.com/smarthome-security to learn more about Canada's most trusted security provider. Hi, Bob. It is so good to see you.
Thank you. Great to see you too.
It's been a while. I think it's been almost 5 years since the last time you were on this podcast.
Yes, but that's okay. We can catch up in a minute, and it'll still be fun. It's like yesterday. It was like yesterday.
It is like yesterday. So your first book was, it was a huge hit. You've written another book now, 21 Things You Need to Know About Indigenous Self-Government, a conversation about dismantling the Indian Act. Why was this book important to write?
There's a couple of big reasons. First of all, like you were saying about 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act, it just sold hundreds of thousands of copies. It was even on the, Toronto Star and Globe and Mail, lists recently again, for bestseller for the week. And so it's been an amazing journey to know that people were interested in that subject. And I did a lot of talks, podcasts and libraries and, Zoom sessions and in-person events. And anybody that was sort of interested in the subject would ask, what can we do about it? Can we do anything about it? And what would it look like? And would it work? And so it really sort of put that idea into my head. Well, maybe they want to know what's next. We understand the challenges of the Indian Act. There does have to be a next chapter. And then also it's personal, when I think about the Indian Act, my dad's a hereditary chief. I'm going to inherit a chieftainship from him. And, all that's left to do is the potlatch. I've got the chief's name in the seat, but I still have to potlatch, give away, distribute wealth. And so, the Indian Act banned potlatching, but we're still potlatching. My mom and dad grew up in an era where they were, not able to vote in the early part of their lives. And, they've always been status Indians. They're both residential school survivors. So it's kind of personal. It's a long way of saying it's kind of personal for me too, to dream that there's an appetite to get beyond the Indian Act. And coincidentally, next year marks 150 years of the Consolidated Indian Act of 1876. And so there's actually going to be a lot of chatter in the communities about it. And so, part of me wishes that we could patch into that conversation and really have some influence. And so writing this book really was about like 21 things, taking a very complex subject with political and constitutional overtones with a really long history and simplifying it for the average Canadian so that they could understand that self-government won't be just good for Indigenous peoples, but it'll be good for non-Indigenous peoples, for Canadians, for Canada. It'll help us get to our high ideals as a country.
It's interesting because I think I know a lot of people don't know what the Indian Act is. And the thing about your writing and the way you've set up your two books is that it is really easy to digest. Anybody can pick this up and digest what it's about and what can be done. Let's just back up for a second. So if someone's listening and they don't know what the Indian Act is, how do you describe the Indian Act?
It was initially in Canada's relationship, to go way back, and so we can see some big eras that we've actually been through as a country. And way before we were a country, in 1763, King George III recognized indigenous peoples, Indians, as nations or tribes of people, and that they lived under our protection, meaning his colonial government, and that they should not be molested or disturbed in the possession of such parts of his dominions and territories. So he really set into place a nation to nation relationship. He really recognized and valued them as valuable military allies and valuable economic allies. And so that was the nature of the relationship as it started off, as opposed to the John Wayne movies, which were all about conquering and Custer's Last Stand and that kind of stuff. And that sort of steamed along till we became a country in 1867, and we saw a flip flop in Indian policy in 1867, and we decided for a couple of broad reasons. One, they were struggling. They didn't have immunity. We've just come out of a pandemic. They didn't have immunity to, very straightforward diseases that everybody else had immunity to. And so we saw very rapid depopulation, and it set the stage for a dying race of people idea. And they weren't, so that, because it's a dying race of people, they're not fitting in militarily and economically anymore. And so Canada believes that the best thing that could happen is that they assimilate and become like everybody else. And so that sets the stage for the consolidation of the Indian Act. And at the time we did it, Canada sets itself up as the trustee. So as a status Indian, even an adult one before you here today, I'm basically a ward of the crown. I have a number, and but the idea was they would just keep me in that relationship until I assimilate. And once I did, they would have less Indians and no need for bans or the reserves that we set out. And so that's what the Indian Act was designed to do. And it started out, the intentions aren't too bad. Oh, we're going to help this dying race of people. But then it becomes really aggressive. And, they're not assimilating. We should do more. We should take away the kids. We should, not let them vote and keep them out of pubs and, all of the things that other peoples were able to do. We were experiencing that stuff. And by the late 1960s, Trudeau and Chrétien were young ministers, were tasked with what do we do about the Indian Act? And so they took a look at Indian policy as it stood, and they came out with the 1969 white paper policy paper. The gist of it was, we live in an unjust society. We should transfer title to the reserves and get rid of the Indian Act. And so, for the first time, we saw this opening in Canadian politics to talk about the Indian Act, which had largely steamed along unnoticed, residential schools and all of that stuff, lack of understanding or even knowledge. And so that's, the Indian Act for you really was put into place. The response from the chiefs at the time of the white paper was, just so let's see if we understand you here, Tamara. You're going to cut us loose right now with little or no opportunity to pick ourselves up and, look after ourselves. And, we actually think you have a legal obligation to do that until we can look after ourselves. It's like you can't kick out your ward if they're not ready. That was kind of the messaging, right? And so they countered with a white paper policy, and that had, led into more conversations. And eventually we see the patriation of the Constitution Act, 1982. And in there, we see some legislation that really opened up the door, for Indigenous peoples to have a voice. And they're still interested in broad human rights issues. We have cultures and languages, and we want to grow and support those. And so Section 35 of the Constitution Act started to take a look at that and say, we hereby recognize and affirm the existing Aboriginal treaty rights, and here's who Aboriginal peoples are. And, they talked about the rights being guaranteed equally to male and female persons. And so it was a very, it was a turning point, and it opened up the door right away. But, one of the first challenges we saw was the Indian Act was fairly aggressive towards Indian women. It wanted, it targeted women. If you were a status Indian, prior to 1982 or 85 is when we really see some legislative changes. And you married a non-Indian, you would lose your status, and so would the children, which meant you had to go somewhere else. And so we saw a lot of change at that point. And really, the women sort of led us into conversations. We saw an amendment to the Indian Act as a result of some political pressure around the status Indian piece.
About status and the women and voting and all of that. Once you start with these narratives, they just gain steam, and then nobody can really determine what is real or not, even though this is in our history. It's not, it's not made up. So what do you say to those types of things?
A big part of what I do is just try to help educate people, to get them more information. In fact, if you ever came to one of our training workshops, I would lead with, "This is who I am." And, today we're going to talk about very complex issues and emotional subjects. And I'm not here to convince you of what's right or not right, or fair or not fair, or equal or unequal, but I will give you more information. And what you do with that will be entirely up to you. You'll have to decide at that point whether you hang on to your old ideas or get new ones. But just know I'm not going to try and convince you of any of those kinds of things. And I will give you different perspectives than you've likely had in your lifetime. And so what we see in like a 3-hour Indigenous awareness session is quite a bit of change, within those groups. A lot of times people come up later, "I didn't know what I didn't know. And I can't believe, this happened." And, people are quite shocked. In fact, when I talk about the Indian Act in front of people, I have to be sensitive, because for some people, it's like the first time. And I can remember I did a session out in Abbotsford, it's probably the third or fourth session. And I can remember at the coffee break, a woman came up to me crying. As soon as I called for, "Okay, that's it. We'll take a little break. We'll grab coffee, come back at 15. And this woman came up, tears streaming down her face. And, what's wrong? Can I help you?" And she said, "I can't believe you." And I said, what do you mean?" She said, I can't believe what you just said." And I said, "It would help me if you'd be a little more specific." She said, "Well, I can't believe my church would be involved in those schools you were talking about." And I said, "Oh, yeah, you know what? I did say I would share additional information with you. It's, I do work for a crown corporation here, and I can't just make anything up and come out and tell you things. This is, field tested, and it's backed with reliable evidence and all of the things that you would expect. And all I can tell you at this point is you're going to hear a lot more about this subject. This country will explore this, in the years to come. And you're just on the front line, frankly, of hearing about residential schools." And so there was this, she had a real struggle with that. I felt, that she would have to really face some, soul searching questions.
I mean, the truth does hurt sometimes. And having to look at the past, human beings can be horrible. I mean, we see that every day. And don't you feel like it's our responsibility to educate ourselves on what happened in the past and to do better as we move forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And we will move forward. We have to give up ideas and, you know, ideology. Sometimes we have to really wrestle with those things. And for a lot of people, I think the challenge they have is, what do you do if we're challenging something as direct as religious beliefs and whether your church could be involved in a residential school? I mean, how do you reconcile that as a human being?
Well, I have this question. What would happen if the Indian Act was ripped up today? Can it be, or is that just absolutely impossible? It needs to be unraveled, or what does that look like?
Yeah. So Trudeau and Chrétien were proposing in their 1969 white paper, policy paper, we should transfer title of the reserves and just get rid of the Indian Act. And as I said in that, sort of case study, I said, that The communities were concerned that we just don't have any resources to pick ourselves up and look after ourselves. You're just going to cut off funding for healthcare, housing, and education, and things that were important to them. So they they basically held the federal government to the fiduciary duty. You have a legal obligation. You consider us incompetent people, and words of the crown. You can't just push us out the door because you don't find it convenient anymore. And so they held the federal government up to its fiduciary duty and said, but if you do want to talk about this, we think there are ways that we can move beyond the Indian Act with self-government, that we can start to change a lot of this. And so we do see a bunch of self-government agreements across the country. They're slow. There's not been that many 25 agreements involving 45, 50 First Nations, but there's over 600 in the country. And they're making great strides. I think about West Bank First Nation, where they've got residential real estate and thousands of non-Indigenous people living on their land, paying taxes so they can do programs and services. And so there's lots of great things that can happen that way. And also there's a little shift in thinking, even on the Indigenous side, where they're like, if we lose the Indian Act, we won't have anything. But what's covered in the Indian Act, healthcare, housing, and education, is covered outside of the Indian Act for the average Canadian.
Right. So what does self-government mean? What does that mean?
It means getting rid of the Indian Act. So right now, we told them, when we consolidated the Indian Act, Tamara, I know you're a matriarch and you're a leader of your community, but that really can't be the way it is. You need to elect officials now, and we're going to let you go ahead and do that. You're going to start to elect the band chief and council members. And Tamara, if you had 200 people, we'd let you elect the band chief and a council member, but you only have 179. So you're going to basically elect the band chief, and they're going to run things for 2 years. And then you're going to have another election, and then that's how things will work. So they start to overthrow the governance systems that were in place and replace them with band chief and council systems. And then because it's federal money, there's all kinds of strings. The complaints I've heard are there's just binders full of policy and regulation that's untouchable and unmovable. And so they have to, they have to run that. So basically you'd be elected by your people, but you'd be accountable to Indian affairs. And that's the part that doesn't give them any room, So I'll give you an example. Be nice to have some control, but we were doing some work. We visited a community called New Vancouver. The chief was there building houses, and it was a community that had kind of left and kind of went back, and he was building houses. And I had a chance to ask the chief, so a lot going on here. This is great. What has your ire today? And he said, well, this was an island community. It's accessible by boat and float plane. And he said, so we're building these houses, but Indian Affairs requires us to build sewers and sidewalks and roads. And, his question to me, it was very rhetorical. Do you see cars? And so, that's the kind of little things that drive the communities crazy. They got a policy in Ottawa. They're not there on the ground. And so self-government would mean the ability to break away from that, to do things that make more sense for the community, as opposed to the politicians in some other part of the country.
No, you're absolutely right, Bob. That is, you absolutely nailed it right there. It's so true. I have more questions, obviously, but before I do that, I just want to say that we like to thank our guests for being here, and we asked them to choose a registered Canadian charity of their choice. You chose Rainbow Railroad Canada, and we're going to make a donation in your name as a thank you for being here. So thank you very much for choosing them. So, I mean, yeah, you nailed it there. As a non-Indigenous person, when I see another non-Indigenous person being what I would consider racist, what I would consider, not contributing to the betterment of the people of this country, including my Indigenous friends, how do we fight back?
I think, when those conversations are happening, if people are, if they feel safe enough, they should actually just say something. And it doesn't have to be much. Oh gosh, I heard that, but I don't think that's quite the full story. And you could just leave it at that, because sometimes those politicians, especially if nobody says anything, they're, well, I must be right. I'm on the right track. Right. And so if we let those ideas go unchallenged in our church groups and our families, and then that's what happens. They need just a little challenge. And you know, it it's just, yeah. And people
Well,
don't.
some of us are more comfortable at challenging. Like I have no problem challenging, right? But let me explain this to you. I challenge somebody that uh, is in my family, and I was challenging him about something because I had interviewed another person on the podcast, an Indigenous woman who was brilliant about our forest management and all that sort of stuff. And I said something, and this person yelled back at me, everything is colonialism to you. You think everything is colonialism. And I kind of paused and I said, well, it is. It kind of is. Like, hello. And it's funny because that word colonialism can really set people off. And why do you think that is?
Well, if you look at just the basic definition of colonialism, it says, being taken over by a larger power by a smaller power. So if that offends you or makes you feel uncomfortable, then I would say you got a good value system. And what you're really rejecting is having to have feelings about that, right? And that's all part of reconciliation. Yeah,
Like, I am not my ancestors, right? They made me, and there's all kinds of stuff in there, but I am not responsible for any of their actions. But I am responsible for my own actions, and I know better, so I do better.
yeah, yeah. See, perfect, pretty easy, right? They on the legal side. So if we separate you and I in this conversation on the legal side, remember Lulu Island just came out, right? The Cowichan tribes just won, and part of the ruling, and it actually included privately held land, and it gave a period of time, I think of it as a cooling off time, and we're going to let you guys try and sort this out yourself. But so on, there's our personal beliefs. I don't think the world should work this way. And then there's the commitments we've all made to the Constitution and the country to be better citizens for everybody, not just some of us. And so in the corpse, in that decision, they basically said, yeah, you know what, we're not going to look the other way anymore. The Crown gave you land that it didn't actually have the right to give you, and we need to talk about this, right? Whether so I think, kind of siloing it out a little bit. Here's our personal ideas, and here's our constitutional legal commitments, and then you got politicians who run whatever side of the conversation thinks will get them the best votes.
Right. Well, the best way to get a reaction from people is to strike fear in them, right? Like, actually, they're coming for your house, Tamara, and they're going to take your house away from you. And it's like, well, no. But let's talk about the things that you were just talking about, right, Bob? Like, it's like there is, Crown land is, I mean, we could do a whole podcast just on that. There's so many things we could talk about, but I do want to ask you about this saying, nothing about us without us. What does that mean to you?
So, whatever we decide to do, it shouldn't be one of those politicians saying, here's what I think's best. I'm sorry, we've got enough experience with politicians who will say, trust me. And it's just not going to happen anymore, right? And so nothing about us. Like, if you're going to make policy about child welfare and when you should apprehend kids, I don't want some guy that went to law school and went to, like, you know, just it just drives me endlessly crazy. Why not talk to the communities about what would be an appropriate, justice program or policy or procedure? Membership. how come Indian Affairs gets to tell us who our people are, and everything about us without us isn't that solution? But the communities instead work with us. We'll come up with solutions. And honestly, in my work in extractive development, they had better solutions than we did, anyways. Here's what we think we could do, but it would take them months to educate the engineers, and who it's I remember this one. I'll give you a quick example. I know you need to wrap up. This one group just said, well, if we just go in there with jobs and economic opportunities, that's what they want. And so it's like, oh, we went and made this great pitch, all slides and jobs and economic opportunity, and listened very patiently. The community listened very patiently, and the chief just finally said, this is all great. It's fabulous. I love what you're talking about. We're not actually ready to take any of this on. Like we got more. We need a healthcare center. We need a healing center for our survivors. If you can help us with that, we're not against your development. We just hope that you could share some of that wealth with us so we can deal with some of our pressing social issues. And so it was a good lesson in about us. Without us, they just want jobs and business development. I know what they want versus listening to it. And so
it's so good. Bob, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. And I'm trying to end on a bright side these days because, it's nice to remember what the bright side of things are. So when you think about the work that you do and your new book that is, just been released into the world, what is the bright side for you?
Well, the bright side is there's great people like yourself out there with podcasts who are trying to tell important stories for their listeners, or what I often think of as learners. And it really is the bright side of Canadian society that they would make a book about the Indian Act a bestseller. That for me is it's all bright side.
Oh yeah, you're so right. There's a lot of good people. There really are. And my husband always says that to me. He always says, Tamara, there are more good people than bad people. You have to remember that. And sometimes I can't remember that, it's, because if you spend any time on social media, you would not believe that. And so, he's right. There are a lot of good people in the world, a lot of people.
And those are the ones we're talking to, right?
That's right. That's right. Okay, listen, people can find your website at 21things.ca. That's a 2 and a 1, 21things.ca. You're also on Instagram at bobjoseph.21things, again with the 2 and a 1. The new book, it's out now, is called 21 Things You Need to Know About Indigenous Self-Government, a conversation about dismantling the Indian Act. Bob, such a good book. Congratulations on this one. And thank you so much for your time again.
Oh, thank you. This has been such a wonderful opportunity. If you get a lot of questions, just reach out again. We'll answer them.
Thanks for listening to another episode of TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Be sure to subscribe so you can join us every Tuesday for another conversation. You can also check out our website, telus.com/podcast, and subscribe to our YouTube channel at TELUS Talks.